What's this about rules for pa's and sons?
There was a time, not that long ago, when primetime television in the U.S. looked a lot like this.
A ham for Lassie.
But today, it looks a lot more like this.
I love you.
This shift can be traced back to a revolutionary moment in programming history over 50 years ago that forever changed television. Television has long been a centerpiece of American culture. By 1955, half of U.S. households had a television set, and by the early 1960s, that figure rose to 90%. But what was popular on TV at the time, mostly variety shows, game shows, soap operas, westerns, and light comedies, wasn't exactly reflective of the contemporary world.
There were some major events unfolding during the 1960s, including probably most predominant for a lot of people was the ongoing war in Vietnam. There was also the continuation of racial justice, civil rights. So with entertainment, the comfort food, shall we say, of the, especially the 1960s was silly. The default for entertainment was to not rock the boat, to be reassuring.
I'm having trouble enough believing a toaster that works when you say 5. But a square egg, that's ridiculous.
It's important to remember that in that era, there were three main forces of television, CBS, NBC, and ABC. There was no cable option for the vast majority of the country. There was no satellite, there was no streaming. There wasn't even the ability to record a show to watch later. So essentially, when you were talking about watching television, you were watching the curated offerings of three major commercial forces whose number one motivation was to make the most money possible. And for CBS in particular, at the beginning of the 1960s, they had struck gold with rural comedy.
The Andy Griffith Show is definitely the most popular. That kind of started the craze for CBS in 1960, followed by the Beverly Hillbillies in 1962. Then you have Petticoat Junction in 1963, Gomer Pyle, USMC in 64, and then Green Acres in 1965. And that comprises the core of the rural craze.
All of these very popular series had something in common. They featured stereotypically country characters in silly, anodyne situations, miles removed from the tensions of civil rights at home and war abroad. And there wasn't a person of color anywhere in sight.
Aaron Rubin, who was a producer of The Andy Griffith Show and a couple of these others, he said, people are watching the show to escape, and if they see people of color, they think of unrest, they think of troubles, and we don't want them to be thinking about problems. We want them to be happy. And so that's why we're only showing white people.
As a business, though, the reason CBS was going to favor the comfort food was that it had worked. It had worked certainly since the beginning of the 60s. Why in the world would there be a thought of even changing that?
There's a couple of things going on in the late 60s that are going to lead to some pretty big changes. For one thing, the demographics that you see with television are changing and they're getting much more sophisticated. The baby boom generation is starting to come to adulthood, and they are now the targeted consumers. And so you need to not only get that coveted 18 to 35 demographic, but there's a serious generation gap between their parents and this group.
In addition to shifting demographics, the major networks were facing a deadline to make significant changes to their lineups. New regulations in 1970 required local TV stations to reduce the number of hours that big network shows were given during evening primetime in order to foster more diversity of local and independent programming. This forced reshuffling presented the major networks an opportunity for transformation. In a radical move meant to catapult CBS ahead of its competitor networks, the company appointed a 33-year-old vice president, Fred Silverman, to lead the charge, which he did, bringing about a revolution in programming on a scale that no network had ever attempted before. His first target? Rural comedies.
Rural comedy came under fire for this a little bit at the time because they're on the air at a point when you are starting to see people starting to talk about diversification and saying, okay, maybe this doesn't really reflect what America looks like. Maybe we should put some people of color on here. Maybe we should, spread our wings a little bit and explore some different kinds of stories.
CBS, under Silverman's direction, did just that, wiping most of the rural comedies from the slate and introducing new shows that were unlike anything that had been seen on television before.
Don't do no more of that.
America's favorite family is at it again.
All the Family was the breakout hit.
If God had meant us to be together, he'd have put us together. But look what he's done. He put you over in Africa. He put the rest of us in all the white countries.
Well, you must have told him where we were, because somebody came and got it.
Maude, a fiercely independent older woman.
I think it's going to cause a lot of trouble.
You had Good Times, which was a black family in Chicago.
How high is it now, JJ?
I don't know, Thelma, but it says to be continued on the next thermometer.
You had the next door neighbors to Archie Bunker, George Jefferson, move on up to the city and have their own program.
How can you afford to live in a place like this? You ain't tall enough to be no basketball player.
And the lead performers were black performers. And it was joyful in the celebration of their own identity.
CBS wasn't the only network aboard the revolution. NBC also launched new groundbreaking series in the early 70s like Sanford and Son and The Flip Wilson Show, the first variety show with an African-American host.
Thanks, y'all. I can't tell you how much I appreciate that. Fine ovation.
Initial reactions to the programming shift were, not surprisingly, mixed. As actor Pat Buttram of Green Acres famously remarked, CBS canceled every show that had a tree in it. President Richard Nixon and some other conservative members of Congress criticized shows like All in the Family for being, well, in their opinion, not family-friendly.
The point that I make is that, goddamn, I do not think that you glorify on public television homosexuality.
But all controversy aside, the popularity of Silverman's new lineup for CBS demonstrated that networks could take a risk in targeting new audience segments and still be successful.
That was something that would not have been on the schedule prior to the rural purge. This was an opportunity for success, and nothing drives programming decisions on television more than financial success. And when you're talking about these programs being top 5 or number 1, winning their time slots and so forth, then that means that's where we want to go. That's what we want to copy. And it changed the attitudes of what was acceptable, and it changed the options and opportunities in the immediate aftermath of that success.
Despite its ominous name, the rural purge didn't mean the end of all rural-oriented programming. First off, many of the primetime series canceled by CBS didn't disappear. They simply lived on in syndication in reruns. But the networks also recognized that they still had to cater to important rural and southern demographics.
CBS is going to throw the rural comedy audience a bone to some extent. In 1971, they air a Christmas special about the Waltons, and that turns out to be so popular that they create the show The Waltons, which is going to be very popular for that network for a good portion of the 1970s.
The legacy is you can succeed in many different ways, and you could choose to try to appeal to everybody, or you could try to carve out portions which you can profitably program to, and in effect create multiple channels of viewing, not just multiple channels of opportunity for people behind the scenes. If you start tracking from the 70s into contemporary times, we're talking about multiple decades here. Nonetheless, what we're looking at is more and more people saying, I want to do this. How can I do this?
The answer has arrived in the form of new television streaming platforms, which have access to a quantity of data that was inconceivable during the first era of television.
TV networks largely relied on a third-party provider like Nielsen to give them sort of samples of what people were watching. Nielsen would measure based on a subset of the population and extrapolate from that to not guess, but to give an estimate of how many people were actually watching. Most of these streaming services know to the person how many people are watching a show at a given time or in a week or in a month. They know what they're watching. They know whether they, how they interact with the interface. Are they opening a title and watching it for 2 minutes and then stopping? After they finish one title, what do they go to next? It gives them a lot more information and data to decide what is and is not working. I think that in the past couple of years, diversity has become more and more important, I'd say. And part of that is just because as you become something that you want everybody to watch, you need to make something that appeals to everybody. I think a lot of these services sort of started by appealing to wealthy people on the coasts of the United States, probably majority white. They were going for, Netflix early on was sort of the HBO model, where you want to make a show that wins awards and appeals to, people who live in Beverly Hills and West Hollywood and Soho and things like that. As it's gotten bigger and it's speaking to more and more of the population, you've seen that it is, telling stories from all backgrounds. And in particular, one of the things that's almost entirely new to streaming is these services are global. And so not only is a company like Netflix trying to speak to people of kind of all creeds and color in the United States, the majority of their viewers are, in the long run, potentially going to be non-white. They're trying to reach people in India, they're trying to reach people in Korea, they're trying to reach people in Japan, they're trying to reach people in throughout Europe, throughout Latin America. All these people have slightly different tastes, and it means that in addition to making shows from a diverse group of creators in the US, that they're funding shows from an even more diverse group of creators outside of the US. And in many cases, it's because of what tastes are.
During the time of the rural purge, you had limited access to limited resources of information and entertainment. Now that's flipped, and you actually have to make a conscious decision to turn off, to filter the many resources that are offered to you.
Decades later, the legacy of the rural purge is more relevant than ever. That representation and diversity in media not only matters for society, but also makes good business sense. By taking a risk that ultimately paid off, CBS and the other networks ushered in a media landscape that more closely mirrored the faces and values of our entire society. And we have that moment in history to thank for the rich and diverse array of programming that is offered by the channels of today, and undoubtedly tomorrow.